All right, so hello everybody. Today we're going to try something a little bit different. We're going to be introducing the first video as a new series on our channel that we hope helps new players kind of learn the basics of the TCG and learn how they can get started with the different archetypes that are out there. So the first, I guess, color archetype we're going to focus on with the series is the blue archetype. So the basic premise of these videos will be going into details on what makes the deck what it is and what makes the archetype what it is, going over, as each meta comes in and there are different decks that take over that sort of color, quote unquote, like what about those decks retain that core aspect of that particular color and what makes it, for example, a blue deck or a red deck or a green deck, etc. So hopefully this is helpful for new players. Hopefully also this can be a refresher for some players that are just taking a break from the game and getting back into it after a long break. So without further ado, let's kind of dig into blue as a color and what it's about. So um me personally, I've been playing blue pretty much since I got into the game. For me, it's probably been one of the colors that has eaten really well as the game has evolved over time. Red and blue typically have been the two colors that have benefited the most from a wide range of support throughout the different metas and has received a lot of different new tools and new toys to play with each new set. Um, where I think, the four original colors with red, blue, yellow and green, like I said, red and blue have probably been the two that have benefited the most from a lot of new mechanics and new gameplay. So I think what sets apart red from blue, for me at least, is sort of just the play style. With red, we're really focused on a lot of aggression, a lot of early big aggro, whereas blue, you're looking at more so sort of like a mid range tempo deck. So if you're looking for a deck that does damage more so by accumulation and more so damage by like smaller checks, smaller swings that as a whole add up to like an overall big game plan, blue is sort of what your deck is all about. A lot of the mechanics and a lot of the core aspects of blue's gameplay stems a lot from board control, tempo control, like I've mentioned, and sort of memory and resource efficiency. So really swinging the game in favor towards your end within that aspect to take control of the game itself and go for the win. A big thing in Digimon is resource management. I think a lot of what we do that's different somewhat from different games is that you do have sort of a dynamic memory system or resource system. Whereas games like, for example, Dragon Ball or One Piece, or I think even like Battle Spirits and Shadowverse to a degree is like you have your own memory, like your own resource system to play with. Whereas Digimon's is you're also kind of playing your opponent's resources as well. And I think Blue does a very good job at controlling both ends of it. It's good at helping your side out and also suffocating and suppressing your opponent's ability to use and manage their own resources. So when the first sort of decks in blue came out, a big mechanic it focused on was something called source strip. So for those who aren't familiar with the idea of sources, so the whole point in Digimon is to take, for example, a level 3, which we don't have here, but like a lower level Digimon and digivolving on top of a higher level Digimon. So for example, we went into a level 4, into a level 5, which will then eventually go into a level 6, etc. And usually in the areas right here, you'll have inheritable effects. So these are really sometimes the bread and butter of your decks. Will give your decks a lot of the firepower that they're looking for and give you a lot of what you want to do, or a lot of effects that you can do with the deck. So with Source Strip, the whole idea is to take those sources and take them away. So you're really taking away a lot of your opponent's inheritables, a lot of your Digimon sort of effects, so to speak. So a lot of the early blue mechanics were focused on source strip and taking those sources away from your opponent and limiting what their Digimon can do ultimately. As source strip and the game itself evolved, it brought in a new sister mechanic, which a lot of folks have very strong feelings about, which is stunning or freezing opponents out of the game.
Hi,
So
hi. I'm strong feelings. Allow me to
out of
introduce
all the
myself.
games we play, I am so sorry.
I know it's okay. I understand. It's how it goes. Um, Something I just want to add in real quick too is I think along with these mechanics that we're about to go into and everything, one of the most appealing things about Blue is how interactive it is from your perspective against your opponent.
Mhm.
Like Ben was saying, the control mid range and everything that happens there. Um, there's a lot of card games that like don't really interact with your opponent's board as much outside of like doing some form of damage, or like a lot of times there's games that just sort of play to their own thing, or aren't as interactive against other turns, or can't like really do anything to affect your opponent's turn as much outside of maybe removing some bodies. Um, and Blue definitely gives you that feeling of, oh hey, I'm going to do this and then do this and then do this, and you can feel your turn really extend because of how it functions. um, and I think it's very, very inviting. um, but you also kind of have to switch your mindset for it in a way, because you sometimes if you try and think like red, for example, just go pure aggression, it can come back and bite you. But anyways,
No, I
that's
agree. I
back
agree.
to first stripping.
I think a big appeal for me too, when like, and we'll get into a little bit this too later on, but it's just how toolboxy this archetype is that you can really, depending on how you want to pilot it and depending on how you feel like your matchup is, you are able to do a lot of different things with the decks that you have available. So
Yeah.
that also really appealed to me as a player. Um, but yes, so stunning was a sister mechanic that sort of evolved from the source strip, and we really saw it come into prevalence with BT7 or the hybrid meta, which again, a lot of players in the community have very strong feelings about one way or the other. But blue hybrids was always a very consistent top before it was restricted, with Tommy being hit to one and Ice Wall eventually being hit to one as well. Before all that, it was just a very suppressive deck, a deck that really controlled your opponent's board to a point where you basically were just playing the game and the other side was just watching you play, which,
Mhm.
you know, differing opinions on how toxic that may have been for sure, but definitely speaks to the power that blue has in terms of your ability to just suppress and control the tempo of the game itself. So
Mhm.
what I mean by stun is basically you take an opponent's Digimon or opponent's monster and they're unable to attack or block for the remainder of not just your turn, but the end of your opponent's next turn. So, for example, a very classic combo that we saw in the hybrid meta was Tommy, who is now restricted to one, whose effect would be to trash three sources off the top of or off the bottom of your opponent's Digimon. So
Play.
at that time, most of your Digimon stacks were probably like 6, 5, 4, 3, and you didn't have the X anti lines. So most of the times you were taking away all of their sources. You could choose to go into a Kumamon for a cost of 2 to strip an additional source if you didn't have enough, and then go into Korikakumon, which would then, having a hybrid on top, stun or freeze one of your opponent's Digimon. You could then swing and use Tommy's inheritable effect to stun another Digimon on your opponent's side. So you can imagine, the amount of just stunning and the amount of just removal of the game that you were able to do. Another combo that was very enjoyable for a lot of blue hybrid players was going into Beowulf, being able to swing over a rested Digimon using Beowulf's effect to bounce an equivalent level Digimon off your opponent's board, which is another mechanic we will get into, and then stunning with Tommy. So you have a lot of board removal, a lot of board control that you can do with a very memory efficient combo. Going into this deck here would only cost you 4. But by going for memory, you could effectively stun multiple Digimon, wipe or bounce things off the board, and force your opponent to really just rebuild their entire game plan right there and then. And you haven't even gone into a level 6 yet. So the power of blue in that regard, with the efficiency and the ability to control, was a huge thing, in terms of just what it wants to do. I think this was sort of the epitome of what blue wants to do for your opponent's decks, which is just suppress, use that advantage to secure tempo into your own advantage, and then be able to chip away in your own way. So yeah, I think the next thing we can talk about is bounce, and sort of what I was alluding to with Beowulf's effect. So bouncing is another form of removal in the game, where you either can delete Digimon, which is either by DP reduction, meaning that your DP or digital power is reduced to 0, or just straight up deleting them, just by effect. Bounce is an alternative form of removal that's more specific to blue in the sense that you're not necessarily deleting, but you're either bouncing them to the bottom of your opponent's deck or bouncing them back to hand. Which I think is a very powerful very powerful effect in certain matchups, particularly for decks and Digimon that have a lot of on deletion effects, because those won't get to proc. Because by bouncing them, you're not deleting them, you're just removing them from play. So a lot of their on deletion effects actually don't go into effect. So purple, for example, is a big suffer, I think, in this regard, in the sense that a lot of your on deletion effects just won't proc, and that just takes away a lot of what your deck wants to do, which is huge. And even purple aside, if you're bouncing a big stack back to hand, I mean, you're basically forcing your opponent to rebuild, and a lot of the resources that they have piled into making that stack or making that boss Digimon are now sort of null and void, and they got to build up back from scratch, which sets them back a turn or two, which is when you can take advantage as sort of a mid-range player to kind of keep chipping away until you can go for lethal. So that was very prevalent in the Gabubond era of BT6, where Gabubond's inherent ability was to bounce a level 5 or below every time it swung to the bottom of the deck, which I thought was huge. That was a very, very efficient board wipe and very devastating board wipe for a lot of decks.
It was also a really strong mechanic in that era because blockers were still relevant for some decks. Not if you were against Gabubon, because there weren't many blockers above level 4. There still aren't that many blockers above level 4 compared to the rest of the game. But yeah, Gabubon would just bounce. You couldn't lay down any blockers. I think one of the other decks, especially one that I played during that meta, was Lilith Loop, and Lilith Loop only has level 4 blockers. And some of your strategies prior to Gabubon was just to Digivolve into Omnimon Swart, which lets you bring back 2 Digimon. A lot of the times you would bring back 2 blockers. You couldn't do that then when Gabubond existed because they would just go back to your hand. And yeah, they weren't as useful. And frequently Gabubond would swing either with a +1 security check from something because you took the aggression early, or it would just finish the game after that with its 3 checks that it frequently had.
Very true. Very true. And then I think now with this upcoming set too, right? I mean, we've got another big boss monster that really focuses on bouncing and adding cards to hand, which is
you do have
the big brother of Mirage Gal. I don't have the BT13. I don't have any of my BT13 stuff in yet, but the new BT13 Mirage Gal, along with this guy from BT11, is going to be wreaking havoc on a lot of players in this upcoming format. Probably not the best deck in the format, but by definitely one of the best decks in the format for sure.
It's a strong,
in terms of what it's able to do.
It's a strong deck for sure.
Yeah.
Because the BT is a BT11 Mirage Galgamon. That one says return a level 5 or lower to your hand, and if it isn't a level 5, if a level 5 or lower isn't returned to hand, the opponent just adds the top card of their security stack.
Right.
And that gets around some of the mechanics introduced in the new set, which when a card is trashed, it activates its security effect. Well, you're not trashing. You're not trashing. You're adding it to their hand. So,
right.
One of the strongest.
Odin's Breath, I believe
Yes.
the card is, which is yellow card that
Yes.
is Kentaro's sort of key option.
And it's a very strong card.
Or Icy Breath is it's Odin's Breath.
Yeah, it's Odin's Breath.
Yeah.
And it's one of the strongest options I think in this set. Because people are gonna be on the be aggressive.
Yes.
And looking to use that Odin's Breath, and if you happen to hit Odin's Breath, that's so huge for you, because it not being able to proc its trash effect or its main effect to -3 DP, and if there are 6 or fewer total in both player security stacks, then it gives everything -1, which for Mirage Gauga or for blue, you're not red, you're not getting security attack +1 effects.
Yeah, not usually. It's very rare.
It's very rare for blue. Yeah, it's very rare for blue to get those conditions to meet security attack +1 are usually out of blue's control. But yeah, getting rid of an option like that or bouncing it to their hand instead of trashing it or hitting it in security, it's pretty huge.
Yeah,
agreed.
For sure. But yeah, Mirage is going to be huge, and it really utilizes the bounce mechanic across the whole line, right? I mean, if you choose to go up the stack and you're able to kind of do what it wants to do, like Mach Gao is bouncing things at times depending on which one you're using, and some of the inheritables will be able to help bounce things too. So a lot of bouncing with Mirage Gao, which will be a huge component of the deck, more so than decks like All Force, for example, or Imperial that we've seen before that sort of utilized it. Whereas Mirage Gao really is centered around the idea of bounce as for blue, it's its main source of removal, at this point in time, outside of the stun.
Yeah.
And another deck that'll kind of be a constant that doesn't utilize the bounce as much, but does really utilize Source Strip and stunning is Blue Flare, which we'll probably either talk about in another video in more detail, but really kind of what it likes to do is strip and stun. It's really sort of an evolution of what blue hybrids wanted to do, but on a more, if you want to say consistent, more meta relevant level now.
It's a more balanced level.
Yeah. There's a good deal of aggression in the deck, good deal of tempo, and a good deal of control. And there are also a lot of variants that you can run in terms of packages and styles of it that you want to throw in depending on your style of play. So very flexible toolboxy deck, sort of like how the color in general is, right? Very toolboxy, very flexible, depends on how you want to play and what kind of style you want to put into it. So very fun architect. I think in terms of, weaknesses that I see in blue, I think TJ, and RB, you have mentioned it as well. And there is aggression in terms of speed and in terms of tempo, but in terms of flat out just like pure aggro, blue is definitely lacking there, right? I think blue as a color, you don't really see a lot of Digimon with high DP. Your boss monsters tend to hover around the 11 to 12k DP, which is on the lower end. We really see that with like yellow and blue, who kind of struggle with that. And in terms of your aggression, you don't have a lot of check modifiers. You won't really be swinging for like +1 check, +2 check, unless you're like sprinkling in a red package with, your different techs and whatnot. But blue will suffer from a lack of like pure aggression if it can't outspeed you.
I don't know if it's like a lack of pure aggression, but you did hit the nail on the head. It's pure power sometimes that blue like lacks.
Yeah. Blue oftentimes they don't DP climb as much. They're usually very good at just trying to control board and move bodies off the board so that they can do their thing. Or they stun bodies like Blue Flare and Blue Hybrids did. Well, Blue Flare does and Blue Hybrids did. In an effort to just sort of, again, control that board state so that you can do your stuff and you can, swing for game and whatnot. Blue in general, I think, is very responsive as a color. It's very much you let your opponent kind of make their play, and then you do your best to counterplay. You just set up for a counterplay oftentimes.
Yeah.
because sometimes that counterplay is enough to just get you the game with the amount of momentum you gain after that. I can't count how many times like I've tried to be aggressive against like your blue flare deck, for example, Ben, and then I just get instantly punished, and then I'm locked out of the game for the rest of the time, basically. So yeah, it's very much like we've been saying. It's tempo and mid range control, and you control that tempo by responding and just pretty much slowing your opponent down after they try and set something up, or if you can catch them because they couldn't find the right piece, or they were just you memory choked them enough where they weren't able to pull off their big play, and you can cut them off early because they made a misplay and maybe race the stack out to try and get some advantage, something like that. It's the amount of momentum you can generate from that is it can be incredible. Sometimes it just wins you the game.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think you mentioned it too, right? I think, I do think it does take a little bit of skill to also pilot the right situation. I think you have to be reactive, but you also have to know when to react. And I think I'm still growing in that regard, but like I think over like the past year and a half of playing, like I've definitely seen myself like about a year ago, I would have made a play that I'm like, whoa, that was not the right play at the time, because it would have been like too early to move forward with something, or too early to to act on something, and I've kind of jumped the gun or missed my window. I think it is something where you have to pilot it well enough where you can react at the right time, because if you do react too early or too late, then you're in a lot of trouble, and you've given your opponent that much of an advantage, which sometimes can be lethal.
Yeah, and it's not even just also your own ability as your own skill to recognize your own plays. It also just comes with general game knowledge.
Yeah,
you need to be informed about what other decks can do often, which can sound daunting, but if you just play, you go out there play, or you play cam games or whatnot, you'll learn. You'll see plenty of different decks. You'll read plenty of stuff online. You'll start to understand how a deck functions, and you'll begin to figure out, okay, against this deck I want to do this, against that deck I want to do that, and you'll be able to kind of pick up how you counterplay even some of your worst matchups.
Right. No, for sure. And I think resource management is key and reactivity is key. Going off of the resource management idea, blue, as we said before, is a very resource heavy deck, very good at manipulating your resources. Some staple tamers if you are going to pick up blue. Davis is, I think, almost a must have for anybody starting to play blue. He's a BT3 Davis. He's a memory setter. If for those who don't know, you have tamers that will set your memory to 3 at the beginning of every turn, and Davis being one of them. And outside of being one of the few memory tamer or setters that blue has, he also lets you search. So consistency and resources are huge in the game of Digimon. Davis gives you both. He lets you search for a piece that you're missing. You look at the top 3, pick up a blue and green. If you're playing a pure blue deck, you're only going to pick up a blue, obviously. But dual color decks, like some of the armor decks or imperial decks, Davis can be definitely a huge boost.
Also, coincidentally, almost
Imperial is a very it's a very blue deck.
It's a very fun deck,
and we've seen Davis used in other green decks as well. Which deck was it? Was it Grand Quagga?
Yeah, they used it in Grandis to grab Grandis pieces for consistency. I even saw some blooms that tried running it here and there, like it's like a one of to just grab certain pieces.
Yeah.
Having a tamer that's also a memory setter and a searcher is very big, and Davis is still one of the strongest blue tamers.
Yeah, I think if you're picking up the game and looking to play blue, I think his price has come down to a more affordable level. Before it was quite high, and then he got reprinted, so he should be a little bit more affordable now. I think definitely having at least 3, if not a playset, is probably a good idea for new folks.
Yeah, I do want to highlight a tip for people who are new to the game. If you happen to find the starter deck, which was it, 11 and 12? Or no,
Jess and Ragna.
12 and 13, right?
Yeah, 12 and 13.
Starter deck Jessmon, starter deck Ragnalord. Both decks will have a copy of Davis along with other Tamers.
Yes.
But Davis is definitely the one you're looking out for.
Davis is the best one out of there. Izzy's probably the next best because he's also a memory setter.
And then those decks. You might still be able to find them in your local card shop because they're just really easy. There's a lot of supply of them. You might be able to find them online for cheaper.
And then
get a Davis.
And they weren't the most chased after decks, so there's usually a lot left over. Something to keep in mind too, at the mention of reprints, at the time of this recording, we are before set RB01, which is Reboot Booster. That will be coming out, I believe, in September.
Yes.
That is going to have a lot of reprints of older cards that are staples in a lot of different decks. But yeah, just as a little nod in there too. But keep going, Ben.
Are they reprinting Davis in that set?
I don't think they're doing Davis.
I don't think Davis is reprinted there. So if you're looking for him, you're gonna still look out for the starter decks.
Next Tamer, Sora Joe. Not as commonly used now. I think their usage has dropped definitely a little bit. But if you're talking like Source Strip, Memory Gain, this was probably one of the staples, at least sort of BT5 to BT7 era. What this Tamer would do, it wasn't a memory setter per se, but it forced your opponent to work around the fact that they could not have a Digimon without a source in play. Yeah. Because if they did, you would gain 2 memory on top of that. And what was also huge was that by suspending this Tamer when swinging, you would strip 2 sources. Every turn you would swing. It's a once per turn, but every time one of your Digimon would swing, you would be able to strip a source, 2 sources off of your opponent's Digimon, which was huge back in the time.
Yeah,
still is.
Yeah, just the fact that it activates itself is still pretty big.
Yeah.
The largest downside to it right now is it's a 4 memory. It costs 4 memory.
It's not as memory efficient as, the game has made it. The game is just too quick now to just hard play it. But some decks are still able to sprinkle this here and there. Some blue flare players will still use this to their advantage. And some blue hybrid loyalists like myself will be using this very, very frequently as well.
In addition, he is one of the Sora and Joe are one of the cards that are getting a reprint in that reboot booster that I mentioned before.
Next, we can't go without talking about the boy, Tommy. He was unfortunately sacrificed for blue hybrid sins. Limited to 1 now.
Yeah, the boy, the devil himself. You mean?
3 cost Tamer, which, as we've said before, would strip 3 sources off the bottom of Digimon, which again is still huge, but at the time was even bigger, given the way that things were set up. Definitely was the heart and soul of blue hybrid. I still think he's useful in some blue decks, mainly just blue hybrid, honestly. Some blue flare players I've seen sprinkle it in, but I really don't see the point in running it, in my personal opinion. I think he's really limited to a blue hybrid sort of role, but blue hybrid, which we'll get to in a little bit, is still around. It's never really going to top, but it's a cheap, accessible deck for a lot of players to play and get used to what the blue mechanic wants to do. So if you are looking to do that, Tommy is your card. Last Tamer I did want to talk about, though, was Matt and Sora from BT9. I think an underrated Tamer. What it does is that at the start of your main phase, if you have more than 8 cards in hand, you gain a memory. And if your opponent also has more than 8 cards in hand, you gain a memory. So early game, if you can imagine, that probably isn't going to come into play, right? But the amount of times that this card has given me that extra 2 memory to start turn at the end of the game to close out has been too many to count. This card has come in clutch a lot of times because there's just no avoiding that effect. Unless you're a purple player and just choose to discard all your cards, this card will be gaining you a lot of memory in the late game.
Yeah, even purple decks before now, when they would draw cards, they would often have card advantage because it would be something like draw 3 cards, discard 2, or draw 2 cards, discard 1. Before before BT13, you didn't really have effects that just made you discard cards from your hand. You would just keep them and have like a huge card advantage with purple.
Right. Right. And then another sort of underrated effect of this card too is that if one of your red or blue Digimon becomes unsuspended, so very common in the Mirage build, in the All Force build, you can suspend this Tamer to bounce a level 3. So bouncing a lot of your kind of pesky level 3s that could potentially be a check for game or block memory, whatever. This card is a way to get rid of them. So a lot of times I have seen this card sort of overtake Sora Joe in a lot of classic blue builds now because it's, again, a 2 memory gainer, has an effect that you can proc when swinging, and can just come in very clutch at times.
Yeah,
I've seen this card really take a
that's
rise.
procs on unsuspend, right? When one of your
Correct.
blue So I think you've used it against me, either you or Jeremy. Used it against me with All Force. And
I think Jeremy has used it a lot.
yeah, I've had a Gazimon to prevent memory gain, All Force memory gain, and the fact that it would unsuspend and then Sora Joe would bounce the Gazi so that they could get the memory gain off. It is a very useful effect because there are, I believe, no memory blockers, no Digimon that prevent memory gain above level 3.
Correct. Yeah. So I think very clutch. So some staple tamers to kind of take a look at. I'm sure there are more that I'm missing, but for each deck, obviously there's going to be tamers that are specific to the deck. But I think overall, for the blue perspective, like these are some pretty solid generic tamers. Moving on to options, kind of a clear cut blue staple at this point is Ice Wall.
One of the best blue cards ever printed.
Yeah, and I can't right now. I mean, it's oppressive even at 1.
Yeah,
I can't even remember. Like, I don't even want to remember what it was like running at 4. Just
it was
sort
not.
of...
It was not. I ran it. I ran it during the 1 week it was available to run it for, and it was not fun for your opponent.
Well, I mean, I think if I remember correctly, like the first ever nationals for Digimon, this was a 4 of. Like people were running this at a 4 of.
I don't.
It
I
was
don't
still
remember.
viable at 4.
Yeah, I don't remember because I think there was just 1 week between EX01 and the next set, and I remember Ice Wall was limited to 1 right after.
For those that don't know what Ice Wall does, basically it's a cost 1 to play, so very, very efficient to play. And all of your opponent's Digimon, whether it's they raise up from breeding, they hybrid, or whatever it may be, Digicross, they play with Rush, whatever, they lose 2 memory. And it's not, and the key thing is that it's not a you gain, which a lot of the memory chokers can prevent through things like Madoki and Gazi and whatnot. It's your opponent loses, so there is no card that will block that as of now. So this was huge in terms of just stalling turn, stopping opponents from going for that lethal swing. It's a late game staller to help you turn the tables and go for game. And in security, it was just you gain 2 memory, which sometimes will lose to the occasional memory choker, but it's still very, very huge.
But that's so huge.
A lot of times, you'll find in matches you will make your play, you will put yourself at 1 or 0 memory after making your play because you're like you digivolve, you do your whole thing, you maybe gain a memory, you're ready to try and just go for game and do a bunch of checks. First check Ice Wall, lose 2 memory, pass turn, and then with how memory efficient blue is and all the different tamers that Ben just listed, you can shoot up to from anywhere from 3 to 7 memory sometimes. And the next thing you know, your big play, you're gone, your stack's gone, you lost all your momentum. And then all of a sudden you're sitting at 2 security and you don't even have an egg. You have to hatch an egg next turn and that's all you can do.
Yeah. And speaking of sort of, memory efficiency, Hammer Spark, not as much of a staple now, but still a very good blue card, was sort of run in all your blue decks towards the beginning of the game itself, and then has kind of filtered out here and there, but I still think it's quite valuable. But Hammer Spark is 0 to play, meaning that you play it for free and it's just an auto gain 1 memory. Granted, your opponent has no way of blocking memory gain. You can just gain a memory. I think it's more useful in security now, where if it's checked in security, very similar to Ice Wall or exactly the same as Ice Wall, you just gain 2 memory.
Yeah, they can do the same exact thing when you can just the scenario I explained. Hammer Spark can do the same thing to you.
So sometimes what I've done too is like I have used Hammer Spark sort of maybe unnecessarily at times, but remind my opponent that I am running Hammer Spark. So now that mind game is in effect, where it's like, okay, well, like I have to maybe play around swinging into a Hammer Spark insecurity, and that causes them to kind of maybe change their gameplay up a little bit depending on how aggressive they want to be. Because hitting this and then security can be, like TJ has said, very devastating for a turn.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty easy option cards to explain.
Last one, again, not as commonly used, but if we're talking about source strip and memory efficiency, Howling Memory Boost is one of the ones that are kind of out there. What it will do, it'll strip 2 sources from a stack. And if it has no Digimon or no Digivolution sources, you can go ahead and stun it. So it can't attack or block until the end of your opponent's turn. And then it has a delay effect, meaning that you can't proc it that same turn. But once it comes back to your turn, meaning that your opponent has cycled through their turn, you can send this to trash to gain 2 memory. So again, with the memory manipulation and sort of control of the board, others will probably opt to use blue memory boost, which is your generic, all colors have this, but it's a memory boost card that on play lets you search for top 4 cards of your deck and pick up a blue Digimon or that particular color Digimon source.
Yeah.
But I wanted to highlight this just because there is a tool out there to use if you want to incorporate the stun, source strip, and memory gain. This encompasses it all in one card right here.
Yep. Honorable mention as well for some of the newer cards. I don't know if you've gotten one yet, Ben. But from the new set that's coming out, that's comes out officially this Friday as we're recording this video. Full Moon Meteor Impact, the new option card for blue that is an 8 cost. It's sort of Mirage Gagumon Burst mode's like key signature move. There's a card in the game called Cocytus Breath, which is effectively just return one of your opponent's Digimon to their hand. That's all it does. The same thing as with the security effect as well. This card does that, but even though it's 1 cost more, you gain 1 memory for every 4 cards in your opponent's hand after you've bounced something for the main effect. Security is just the same thing as Cocytus that just returns something to the owner's hand. But effectively, this option card is just going to be it should be really a blue staple for an option sort of counterplay. If you're sitting in a situation where you don't have time to push out a stack, or you just had to build a stack and back, your opponent has a decently large hand size, play this card. Sometimes you play it for 6 or 5 and you just remove their Digimon from the board entirely.
Yeah,
it's very effective. Just a little honorable mention there real quick.
No, yeah, for sure. I definitely
It's basically
card.
Frequently just a cheaper Cocytus Breath. If not, it's usually just the same cost as Cocytus Breath, because there's very few times in Digimon you'll have 4 cards or less than 4 cards in hand.
Yeah. So I mean, I think kind of to summarize here, we've hit a lot of like the staple cards and kind of talked about blue as a color in general. I think going back to what blue does well and summarize what I like about it, I think it really is a tempo mid-range control deck that has a very toolboxy feel. You can pilot it many different ways, and I think a lot of the fun in it comes, for me at least, comes from the dialogue between the 2 players and kind of anticipating what we'll both want to do. And I think that's very much a blue. I mean, obviously, card games, you kind of have to do that for every color, right? But I think blue is a very react to the situation, fluid type of play style, which I like to enjoy. It's a lot of resource manipulation. You really kind of rely on your ability to kind of anticipate and react in the right situation, which when it pays off is very gratifying and is very good, in terms of just making you feel good.
So rewarding.
Yeah, and I think the toolbox aspect of it, I think, helps because you don't necessarily feel shut down if your one game plan doesn't, like, if you feel like by turn 2 or turn 3 you're like, I don't think this route of attack is going to work, or I don't think this approach is going to work. You do have the ability with some of the blue decks, or majority of the blue decks, to kind of swap and kind of pivot and go another way, which I think is helpful sort of as an adaptability perspective. Whereas some decks I feel like wants to do one thing, and if you shut it down, there's a lot of problems, and it feels almost like you just can't really play the game anymore.
Yeah. Agreed.
I do think in terms of what blue suffers from, sort of like we talked about, like RB had said, pure power doesn't really have a lot of that. Sometimes it's lacking that final oomph or that final like kick to really just finish it.
Yeah.
There definitely have been times like playing, whether it's blue flare or all force or like even blue hybrid back in the day, where it was just like I was like so close. I was like right there. I just needed like one more turn and I could have done it. Or like I was like one step away, but I just didn't have enough juice to get there. And sometimes I feel like you are missing that pure power, particularly now in an OTK format where you have decks that are checking or even just trashing 3-4 security cards at a time. And you're just like, well, I don't really know how to respond to that next turn,
To add to this a little bit, for me, it's facing matchups with blue flare or armor, and you're facing Machine Dramon, which has more than 12k power, and your decks just don't go over that. And instead of blocking, they have an ability which lets them redirect the attack to Machine Dramon. So if you hit Machine Dramon, you die and you lose all momentum.
Right. And I think another thing too, like on that same vein, RB, is like when I played Camry last week, maybe I think it was, and he pulled out quartz, I was like, well, I don't know what to do. I can't take it away. Yeah. And it's just like, it's an uphill battle from there.
Yeah, all force. Yeah, blue's aggression, red's aggression is from swinging once and destroying everything. Blue, you swing multiple times, so you build it up, and then quartz saying that you can't unsuspend. And blue's effects frequently just want you to unsuspend to keep the aggression going, and not being able to unsuspend against decks, especially like with All Force Vidramon, it shuts down your entire deck because everything procs off you unsuspending.
Yeah. So I think there are definitely pluses and minuses to this deck. I personally think it's very fun. I know I've been dabbling a lot into every single color at this point, but I think I'll always sort of be a blue player at heart. So
yeah, blue's
definitely, yeah.
It's the color of drawing cards, gaining memory, stripping sources, and
it's a good color to learn the game with. I think it's what I learned off of.
Yeah. I think it's a very beginner friendly color. You can definitely learn a lot of the mechanics just by playing blue. And kind of get a better knowledge of the game. And I do think it takes a degree of sort of expertise to pilot at a higher level, which I think is set for all colors at this point. But I do think
it seems to be one of the stronger colors overall in the Digimon card game.
Yes. And I think for those who are looking to get into blue, some decks to kind of take a look at that are sort of your staple quote unquote decks right now. As we said, BT13 will be releasing as of Friday, which is just a few days or towards the end of this week at the time of recording. But Mirage Galgamon is sort of the big blue deck for this format. Going to be very strong, a very competitive deck, a very fun deck to play. So look into that. A lot of the pieces you can probably find from older sets. You'll just need some of the core pieces of this set, which should be easy to come by outside of your super and secret rares.
Yeah.
I think EX4 Blue Flare. Yeah.
Mirage doesn't even run in secret rares. To be clear, real quick too. It's all just SRs.
Oh, burst mode isn't even a secret rare. Yeah.
It's all just SRs and Mirage Galgamon. All you need is stuff from BT11, EX4, BT13.
Yeah.
To just build the deck at a base level, that's all you need. If you want some other stuff, then you know, like Ice Wall, super cheap. There's loads of them around.
Mhm.
And Blue Memory Boost, which isn't very expensive either.
Yeah.
Those are only two other cards that are really maybe like up for consideration there. And then sorry, one more card, BT4 Thomas. Just because this deck functions off of the Savers anime, and so it uses, or Data Squad. That Thomas functions well with the deck because he can be used for your burst Evo, which is a whole other thing, and just that's what you want. But just to kind of explain some of the stuff, the deck is pretty cheap to build, pretty easy to build. A lot of it's in very recent sets, so it's not hard to come by. Yeah, that's about it for there.
No, yeah, I think, and then EX4 Blue Flare, again, a very accessible deck. I think your only major expensive card will be BT10 Metal Gray. But all the other pieces should be very easy and cheap to come by. Very fun and accessible deck. All Force, I think, is dying down a little bit. The arena hype has cooled off. It is still a very expensive card. So for those who aren't really looking to break the bank and getting your place at arenas from BT11, you could probably hold off because I think All Force is pretty much unplayable without the place at arenas.
Agreed.
But it is a staple blue deck that people will talk about when it comes to blue. But if you're not looking to really invest big time into it, you could probably hold off because it's also like not one of the more competitive decks in the format anyway.
Yeah.
The Wolf, which has been wounded but will soon return. Melga or Metalgarurumon.
Admittedly,
Yeah.
when it returns, it's not as much of a blue deck anymore. It's also
a purple deck.
It's also purple.
But I think was a staple in the BT like 9 through BT 11 era where it just was kind of running rampant and topping a whole lot. It is limited now with the promo Wergarurumon, which is the level 5, which was sort of the gas of the deck, now limited to 1. So it's not doing as much and probably isn't as viable anymore, but in terms of like being sort of a core blue deck, I mean, the idea of what it wants to do is still pretty much blue.
If you want to play an X Antibody deck that's blue, that's what you're probably looking to play. If you want to use X Antibody mechanic that exists within Digimon.
And then the last one I wanted to highlight, well, last two was, like I said, Blue Hybrids. It's a very accessible, very cheap to make deck if you want to kind of base rarity it. A lot of the cards are all BT7, and again, it's not very meta relevant, but it is something that you can learn sort of basic mechanics and learn hybrid tamer mechanics off of.
Yeah,
and like I said,
there's different versions of it as well.
Yep.
Even with Tommy being restricted to 1, the deck still has some decent options. There's different things you can splice in, like you can put Mirage Gal as your top end in it.
Yep.
It's very toolboxy.
Yep, very toolboxy, as TJ said. A lot of different packages you can run, a lot of different variations that you can run that are all still very relatively cheap. Last but not least, no blue video is complete without, my boy Gabu Bond. I will always try to make it work, even at my own cost. I will make it work. But it is a fun deck, admittedly, especially the Gabu Bond Ancient package. Very fun deck. Very like explosive deck, which is sort of the antithesis of what we said blue was in this video, but still very explosive, very powerful. Very just fun overall. I have fun playing the deck and just wanted to shout out to it. But that being said, though, I think that pretty much wraps up the video, unless you guys had any other closing thoughts.
No, I think we're good.
We will try to make decklist videos eventually for some of these decks. I think we'll try to do like a BT13 Mirage deck, a Blue Flare deck.
Yeah.
Because those are, after we get all our stuff, because those two are probably the ones that are most meta relevant.
You get our stuff and test. I want to make sure if we're uploading the deck profile, we're testing a deck and it's proven to work. We're not just a theory craft.
Yeah. But we'll try to crank some of those out in the next couple of weeks. We also have some regionals coming up in the next couple of weeks, so probably would be around ideal time that we have our testing into. So we will try to get those out for you. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully this is a successful segment and that was also educational for you guys and helped kind of introduce some of these new players to what we love about the game. So
And thank you to King Jarrell for sitting in here to record while we
Yes, sir.
discuss everything.
yes,
Yeah.
can never forget
all
the
the
king.
best.
Next time, I'll be here for Red.
True.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys, and see you in the next one.
Yeah.
See ya.